According to the top 100 best-selling singles in the 20th century, rock and roll music was one of the most popular. Rock and roll artists appeared regularly on the popular music charts. By 1959, 43% of the charts represented rock and roll music, and Elvis Presley was one of the most popular and significant. Elvis Presley would not have been one of the best rock and roll artists if it wasn't for the influence he had from the African Americans throughout his lifetime. The African American influence dealt with Elvis and doing similar moves as other artists during the period he was very popular in. Although he did similar moves and sung with a similar sound as the African Americans, Elvis had the perspective of being a fraud due to the fact that many believed he was the king of rock and roll.
Elvis Presley established many influences and effects toward the society with his impression of loving to impersonate African American music and set it off as his own style. Through the different types of music revolving around his style, Elvis Presley connected these cultural music genres and produced what we now call rock and roll. With the title of being the king of rock and roll, he gave off many perspectives toward his community in order to set off that positive impression rather than a negative one. In such cases, he attended the army to have that positive, influential image, which would later incorporate the idea that he loved being viewed as an influential character. Elvis Presley very much enjoyed the energy that African Americans would give off when performing and would set it off later in history as his own unique style. The influences made an impact in his life, whether good or bad.
But in the 1950s, in particular with Elvis Presley and some other people like Bill Haley in the Comets, a bunch of other artists, you have them wholesale just redoing somebody else's song. And so through re-singing somebody else's work and replaying it and re-recording it, he learned a lot of things that he hadn't learned as a country and western artist. One of the hugest things probably is just his vocal delivery, that he learned to make a lot of sounds that you didn't make in country and western, but you do make in blues or in rhythm and blues or in jump, just by sort of re-recording these other artists' works. And then sort of right down to the blues scale, to the chord progressions they use, just everything he learned from just literally redoing their songs, doing cover versions. So how much did African American artists influence him?
A bad perspective of Elvis Presley included different views on his music. In the 1950s, many people claimed that the music he enacted was copied, as well as the sounds and moves that he had made was similar to the different rock and roll artists prior to him. This would clearly lead to a negative view on Elvis Presley that society had towards him. Due to the fact that Elvis Presley wanted such a strong, positive, influential perspective, there were many people who opposed his view. Many in society would see him as a sex symbol, which would lead towards the misuse of drugs. Elvis Presley was not considered a leader in these cases. His influence toward the other people may have affected the impression he has set off, but not for the way he seemed to look up for the African Americans.
In addition to the many perspectives people had on Elvis Presley, he unfortunately lived in a time of chaos as well. Before the time of the Civil War, Elvis Presley looked up to many people in a musical perspective. As a young boy, Elvis Presley was inspired by many artists. He mainly appealed to music influenced by the blues. Blues music never made an impact until Elvis Presley acknowledged it towards a wide audience. This music genre widely evolved after the Civil War. It was known as the music of the slaves, with a combination of railroad songs and gospel. Many of his influences included artists such as Big Mama Thornton, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and many others. Elvis' influences were also pop and country at the time, as well as gospel music he heard in church and black R&B he absorbed as a Memphis teenager. To the public, Elvis' blues legacy had never been fully examined, and he had a lack of appreciation. In 1954, Elvis began his singing career with the legendary Sun Records label in Memphis. By 1956, he was an international sensation with a unique sound and style that combined his diverse and multiple musical influences. His musical influences were admired by Elvis for incorporating their style of music while recording his own popular music records. As he was influenced by many artists, he ushered in a whole new era of American music and popular culture. His talent, good looks, charisma, and good humor endeared him to millions and became one of the most important figures of the 20th century popular culture.
Definitely. I think terms of rock and roll, like solidifying that as a genre. Like we still have rock and roll. It sounds a lot different than it used to, but it's still, you know, kids put together rock bands because there is, you know, that genre of music. And so he's left a legacy in that sense. He was a part of how we got rock and roll in the first place. He was one of the most popular artists to sing it. You know, it might have been more of just a short-term fashion in the way that a lot of other kinds of music have been if you didn't have somebody that popular who was singing it. He wasn't the only one, but he was certainly one of the most popular. So he left a legacy in that sense, that we still have a category called rock and roll, that we still have kids who choose that as the music that they love and that they aspire to make, or at least listen to a lot. But I think more importantly, what he proved was that Black American styles could be popular to everyone. And so if he left a legacy, it was the idea that, okay, the music can cross over. And that's actually the technical term that we use. We use crossover all the time now, like Taylor Swift crossed over. This just means that you've exited one category on the Billboard chart and gone into the pop category, like the all-over. That, okay, the music can cross over. And that's actually the technical term that we use. We use crossover all the time now, like Taylor Swift crossover. It just means that you've exited one category on the Billboard chart and gone into the pop category, like the all-embracing category. So he came from country and western into the pop chart. He helped other artists come out of the rhythm and blues category, come out of what had been race music into the pop category as well. And so that is a really, really sort of powerful thing that he was able to do. The music is acceptable, but eventually the artists are going to be acceptable in the pop category. And so yeah, you do have Chuck Berry most immediately manages crossover to the pop chart some of the time, but anybody who came out of Motown, there's no Jackson 5 without crossover, there's no Michael Jackson later on without crossover. The fact that it happens so regularly now has sort of obscured how special it was at the moment, that it was really, really striking first to have that sound be acceptable. And yeah, okay, it had to be somebody who was white like Elvis Presley to make it that popular, but that eventually the artists themselves could make the leap and not just their musical styles, and that is a huge, huge legacy.
During the 1950s, African American musicians had some great gospel music. Arthur Crudup, an African American musician, had a great voice but not a great image like Elvis Presley. Image was what the fans looked for in a musician or an artist back then and till this day. In the 1950s, the ideal of a great musician was a white male with good looks and a deep gray voice. Elvis Presley's image was great. He was what the records wanted. He had upbeat, fast music, which people wanted to get up and dance to. His voice was great. His styles of clothes were amazing during the 1950s. His dance was his signature move, which everyone liked. Till this day, image has had a huge impact on artists such as Elvis Presley in the area of rock and roll. He would go to African American concerts and get influenced by the choreography and music from which they sung. Arthur Crudup, an African American musician, was a great singer, but his records did not sell. Elvis Presley took Arthur Crudup's song, "It's Alright," and made it to his own, and records sold. Little Richard was upset that Elvis was paid $25,000 for doing 3 songs in a movie, and Little Richard only got $5,000. J. Cole made the song Fire Squad, and in this song it included Elvis Presley. He was rapping about the idea that Elvis stole music from the African American musicians, and mentions other rap artists like Eminem, Macklemore, and Iggy Azalea, which he states history is repeating itself. Image and race has had a huge impact and effect on music and media till this day.
Elvis Presley created an astonishing legacy. The rock and roll music in the 1950s is ironic because it was performed by African Americans and consumed by whites. Elvis Presley will never be forgotten.